Hello again, and welcome to another worship at home during this coronavirus crisis. And this weekend is Passion Sunday. That's the Sunday 2 weeks before Easter, and the word passion here doesn't have its modern meaning, where it tends to mean strong feelings. Passion in this case is in the ancient meaning of the word of suffering. In other words, we're starting to get close to the cross, and that's beginning to dominate and sneak up on us, if you like, our thoughts as we approach the end of Lent. And so I'm going to begin today with the collect for Passion Sunday. Excuse me as I just get my book. The collects in the book, they're like the special prayers. I call them prayer of the week. They're the theme prayers for each week. So we're going to use the collect for Passion Sunday. Let's pray. Most merciful God, who by the death and resurrection of your Son Jesus Christ delivered and saved the world, grant that by faith in him who suffered on the cross, we may triumph in the power of his victory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. And the Gospel reading for this week comes from John chapter 11, verses 1 to 45. And that means we're in the chapter just before Jesus enters Jerusalem for the last time in John's Gospel. This is the story of the death and the raising of Lazarus. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill, so the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of the world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he'll be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there's a stench, because he's been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upwards and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. And so it is Passion Sunday when the shadow of the cross begins to fall across the story of Jesus. Maybe you don't completely get that from where the reading ends, but it was a long reading, I suppose. In fact, the lectionary edits it. You don't get the whole chapter. And had we read more, you would have discovered that the religious leaders who hated Jesus specifically plotted to take his life in the wake of the raising of Lazarus. And just as that shadow of the cross starts to be cast across the story of Jesus here, so perhaps we're living in a shadow, the shadow of coronavirus. I'm recording this on Saturday. Today it's been announced that 260 more people died in the UK yesterday The day before 180, the day before about 100. It's going up. Workers in the NHS, some of them are describing it as that they're waiting for the tsunami of cases. We've seen the plans for the huge temporary hospitals at the XL Centre in East London, at the NEC in Birmingham, and also in Manchester, and I think Glasgow's been mentioned as well. So, can this story in John 11 help us as we live in our shadow, perhaps with a sense of dread? Well, I think it can. And specifically, I think this story helps us as we still seek to exercise faith at this time. Because I guess for a lot of us, our faith is being challenged. So here are 3 thoughts about that. The first is that this is a story about faith going into new places. In the first phase of the story, where the news is sent to Jesus about Lazarus, that he's seriously ill, but Jesus, almost inexplicably to us, doesn't rush to his side, but he waits another 2 days, waits until he knows that Lazarus is dead. The disciples don't understand. They think Jesus is just saying Lazarus is asleep. But he says, no, look, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you may believe. Let's go to him. The disciples just don't get it, do they? That Jesus is going to bring Lazarus back to life. And I wonder whether Jesus might take us into new places in our faith as we face this pandemic. Could we believe that Jesus will do something new in the coronavirus outbreak? Could we believe that Jesus might do something unexpected and fresh today? Why not? Secondly, there's an issue about faith and God's timing. Because first Martha and then Mary basically say the same thing to Jesus when he does turn up. Lord, if you had come earlier, you could have made our brother better. And they assume that the fact that Lazarus is now in the tomb means that that's it. No hope, he's gone. Some of the mourners say something similar. Couldn't he who gave the blind man his sight, the story we thought about last week, could he not have prevented Lazarus from dying? What the sisters don't know is what Jesus has told the disciples privately in verse 4, when he said, this illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. The sisters assume that everything has to be done before death. And we're facing an uncertain waiting with the coronavirus. But we have a God who works to a different timetable from us. Ultimately, it's the timetable of eternity. How can we wait for God's timing to do something? Well, I like to think of it like this. Faith in someone is based on what you already know about them. You know, for example, that a loved one has certain character. You know that they're reliable. You know they're trustworthy. You know they're kind and they'll have your best interests at heart. And therefore, when you're hoping that they might do something for you in a time of need, you think, what do I know about this person? And I suggest to you it's rather similar with Jesus. There are things we know about him. We know about his love, about his faithfulness, about his power. And therefore, we can trust him to wait for his timing, for whatever he wants to do that is best. And then the last thing I want to talk about is about faith and new life. The last part of the story where Jesus goes to the tomb and where he commands the stone to be rolled away, and Martha says, but it'll stink. And it would have done. And at 4 days you get to the point where perhaps the body can't be recognised so easily. But in the place of despair and death comes life. And that's what Jesus gives. And now, granted, we face potentially death and despair with the coronavirus crisis. Perhaps it's starting to come closer to you. Don't know if you know anybody yet who's got it. We're starting to hear stories in our family, people that relatives know or people we've had contact with in the past. But could Jesus bring life here too? Well, could we be positive? Maybe. I want to share something with you that might be quite startling. Some of you will know the hymn King of Kings, Majesty. For Methodists, that's in our current hymn book, Singing the Faith. And the author of that hymn is a guy called Gerald Cooper. He's a pastor of a church in Hull. And he's a very thoughtful Christian who's very open to the ways of the Spirit. And he published something, turns out about 10 days ago. And he talked about how he'd begun to pray about the coronavirus pandemic and its effect on the UK and upon the world. And he says, as I prayed, I vividly saw God's throne standing strong over a dark ocean of fearful global events. Immediately, I was led to Psalm 29, verse 10. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as King forever. And the flood probably symbolises a dark flood of evil. And if the Lord is enthroned over the flood, perhaps, he says, this reassures us that there's no season where he is not going to bring evil to an end and seek for goodness and mercy to triumph. And he believed that God was saying this at this time. Even now, I am reigning over the flood of sickness, fear and sorrow, moving over the face of the earth to bring it to an end. I am the God who changes times and seasons, Daniel 2:21. And even every evil thing remains under my control. As you cry out to me and call to me, I will answer. This evil will end sooner than many claim. Though some will grieve as they are touched by personal sorrow, to many others this will be remembered as a time when you ask, what was all that about? A time when fear and panic attempted to take over the hearts of men. But see, I am enthroned above the flood to bring the evil to an end. Worship me, pray, and seek my hand. Do not engage in the currency of fear that fills screens and newspapers. Do not be shaken. I decree this shall pass. The times are set by my own authority. Now, I don't know what you think of that, and of course, we should prayerfully test things like that. But Lazarus comes from the grave, and in doing so, he foreshadows Jesus rising from the dead. And our faith in the risen Jesus is what gives us hope that transforms our attitude to the death and despair surrounding us. So while we still need to be sensible, to stay at home,